if you can list out the most common ones, and we talked about this like 1 or 2 episodes ago, but the most common conditions that you see in SSI child cases or any kind of child cases. Kind of just went over it, but
definitely ADHD, anxiety disorders. They call them behavioral disorders if they're acting out in school. Those could qualify under like the affective disorders, depression, things like that. OCD, we don't see a lot of psychosis. Not a whole lot of that. Learning disability, that's a huge one. Learning disability and ADHD are probably, battling for the 1 and 2 spot in what we see. And you're right, we don't see a lot of physical maladies. Not that, kids don't have them. The thing is that the resources and the medical community are pretty good about, dealing with those to give them fairly normal functionality, but not in a mental health. We don't find that at all. I mean, it's like, can you do psychotherapy on a 6-year-old? Well, good luck.
Yeah.
I mean, you can try. Usually what they do is they pump them full of medication. And of course, I'm not going to say that the cure is worse than the disease, but, a lot of these medications just, they have some pretty significant side effects. Like a lot of the medications for ADHD, they calm you down, but they also have some problems with impeding your growth. So,
yeah.
I mean, there's some pretty significant side effects. But yeah, I'd say ADHD and learning disorder top the list of that. The things that we look for, jumping the gun, I'll just go ahead and answer the question I know you're going to ask. In these kinds of cases, what we're going to see is problems in school. If they're not school age, our work is cut out for us. It's going to be nearly impossible to prove that, the child has disabling impairments, because all we have to go on is mom or dad's, description of things. We don't have, and maybe a doctor's, pediatrician or pediatric practice, maybe even a pediatric psychiatric practice. They're out there. But Social Security, and this is going back to what I said earlier, Social Security puts a premium on what the school officials see. Mm-hmm. If they're in 2nd grade, even in 2nd grade, these small children are with other adults for hours upon hours upon hours a week. And these other adults, they got no skin in the game. So they're not like mom or dad. Mom and dad needs the benefits. And so, Social Security, especially judges, are, they're going to kind of look at them, is what you're telling me, is it really that bad? Do the medical records show that it's really that bad? Do the school records show that it's really that bad? So if you have a child who at home is, acting out, throwing temper tantrums, smacking their head against the wall, lying on the floor, beating the floor with their fists, and then they show up to school and they're an A and B student, I'm going to have a real hard time proving to Social Security that this child has horrible behavioral issues. Because what we normally would see is if all that's going on at home, they're having horrible times. The parents are usually in talking to the teacher or the principal weekly. And if we don't see that, it's really hard to prove that. Teachers are, without any kind of doubt at all, the best, the best source of information. And there's this document called the Teacher ADL, which Social Security will send. We'll send them if it gets to the hearing level, and Social Security hasn't gotten them, but they'll always send them. And the Teacher ADL, the Teacher Activities of Daily Living form, it basically just asks, does this child have difficulties in this area. And there are 6 areas, childhood areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're the areas that you would think, acquiring information, using information, getting along with others, communicating with others, taking care of themselves. Can this 12-year-old tie his shoes? Things like that. And the teachers see all this stuff, and they can fill out this form. If the medical records give me a diagnosis, which that's usually all I'm going to get from childhood medical record, I'm going to get a diagnosis. Mom and Dad have filled out the ADL form. He's like this at home, and he's just a tiger that's out of control. And then I get a teacher ADL that says, he's horrible in school. He picks on other children, or he doesn't get along with other children. I've got a great case because everything is lining up.
Consistent.
And it's all saying the same thing.
Yep.
So the teacher ADL, teacher activities of daily living form, they're great. We usually want to get 2, especially if they're in a setting to where they're seeing several teachers, the 2 that see them the most and that know the most. And if you're wondering about why things take really, really long if you apply at the beginning of the year, because right when you get everything rolling in your case, summer vacation.
Yeah.
They're out of school. And Social Security's, we got to get that teacher ADL. Okay, well, the teacher's off until August or September, so we're not going to get that in June and July and early August. So that adds a delay. So that there's always that. Same thing around Christmas time. There's usually about a month, where they're off for Christmas holidays. If they're off, we can't get, especially the school records. It's just really, really hard to get anything from the school when they're not there.
Right. So
we do have a struggle with that. But I like childhood cases. We've talked about this before. In an adult case, I live in the gray. And, when I train my people who come on board, that is basically one of the things I always tell them. We make our living in the gray. And what I mean by that is that they're not really black and white in most of our cases. Sometimes there are. We've talked about, cancers that metastasize, that spread to some other area. That's a meets the listing. Those are black and white. But, okay, well, this person's, they're 48 years old, and, they're having a hard time lifting more than 20 pounds, and their past work was this, and you have to add all of this very complicated information. You have to build it all together and see, is this something that would preclude you from working full time? If it is, I will make an argument, and I'll cite evidence, but I can't cite evidence in a black and white way that I would for somebody with, a terminal disease that's just right there in the medical records. However, in a childhood case, there are only 3 ways that a childhood case can be won. They meet the listing, which means black and white, big time. Childhood cancer, they have ADHD, and they're, 3 grades behind their peers. Teachers are having problems just keeping them doing basic school responsibilities, school tasks. Black and white, or they equal the listing. Not all the I's are dotted and not all the T's are crossed in a meets the listing kind of way, but they equal the listing, which is still black and white. It's just that Social Security Administration takes a little bit or gives a little bit more liberty in what you have to prove. And then there's the third way, and that's the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, and it is functionally equaling a listing. So if you're going to functionally equal, let's say the ADHD or learning disability listings, you're not going to dot every I, you're not going to cross every T, you're not going to go down that black and white list, but it's still black and white because you have to have at least 2 areas of those 6 areas we talked about earlier. 2 of them have to be markedly limited, and you normally get that from the teacher ADL. If they have 2 or more of those 6 areas that are markedly limited, then they functionally equal a listing.
Can you give an example of that real quick? Say a client has ADHD. What would be 2 of those criteria that they have to hit?
Number 1 and number 2, they're acquiring and using information, and then getting along with others.
Okay. And that's proved just using the medical records and then predominantly the teacher's information.
Yeah, a lot of times what the pediatric records will show, even if they're not pediatric psychiatric records for somebody with a mental impairment, which, like I said, that's the vast majority of our childhood cases. But the medical records will show, little Johnny came in and he doesn't make eye contact. But I gave him a train to play with while I was doing my examination, and you get kind of a flavor of what his functional level is. Okay, he's in seventh grade age-wise, but he's reading at the second grade level or less. He has no friends in seventh grade. All of his friends are really, really young, or he doesn't have any friends at all. He plays with his 3-year-old brother's toys. He's in seventh grade. Those kinds of things, and you'll see that in the medical records. But the main thing that we'll be able to use is from the teacher ADLs, the school records.
Right.
They'll do an IEP, which is a kind of a functional, where is this child academically? Those are in all public school records. I think most private schools too, but definitely public school records. They do those periodically, and that'll also tell you. Report cards, believe it or not, are pretty helpful in a disability case for childhood.
Right. If one of the claims is that they have trouble concentrating, but then they're a straight A student, it's pretty hard to believe right?
Yeah, that's going to be hard to sell. But yeah, if they're, since report cards not only give you the grade, they also will say, he's having a hard time, completing assignments, or they're consistently late, or there are consistent sloppy mistakes. And they never get better. Those things pop up in everybody's records from time to time. That's part of growing up. But that's not what you would see in a disabled child's record. You would see it consistently. It doesn't get better. It just they're just kind of out there.
Yep.
So school records will show that. But the first two of the 6 areas of disability, they get more physical as it goes along. But the first 2, acquiring and using information, and then communicating, acting appropriately with others, those are the big ones that we see. And if they're markedly limited in those 2, which is the main ones, especially from a psychiatric standpoint, I'll make a pretty solid argument that this child functionally equals the ADHD listing, or functionally equals the intellectual deficit listing. This person equals the depression listing, affective disorder listing.
If you have a question about your disability case, give us a call at 615-453-9151 Monday through Friday, or click the link in the description of this video.